So, I want to start today by taking you back to 2023. There was this moment when a massive inland sea, I mean, literally the largest freshwater lake west of the Mississippi River, just suddenly appeared right in the middle of California.
Right, which is just an incredible thing to visualize.
Yeah, exactly. And the truly bizarre part about this whole thing, that specific lake had been completely dead and buried for, more than 130 years.
Oh yeah, totally erased from the map.
Right. So today we were doing a deep dive into the source material to look at how this ghost lake somehow resurrected itself and basically swallowed 100,000 acres of established farmland. And, we really want to unpack what that terrifying yet kind of awe-inspiring event actually tells us about the state's survival.
I mean, it is just a phenomenal starting point because it forces us to, look past the pavement and the agricultural fields and really confront the underlying physical reality of the landscape itself.
Exactly. And to really set the stage for you as you're listening to this deep dive right now, I actually want to back up just a little bit before that lake appeared.
Okay, where are we going?
I want to take you back to a memory from that multi-year drought. The really bad one between 2020 and 2022.
Oh yeah, that was brutal.
It really was. Like, if you've spent any time in California, this is probably just burned into your mind forever. You would look eastward toward the Sierra Nevada mountains during the absolute dead of winter.
Right, the time of year when those peaks should just be completely buried under this blindingly white snow.
Exactly. But what you saw instead was, well, it was just bare granite. You saw naked gray rock just exposed to the blazing sun in, like, January and February.
Which is so alarming to see in person.
It was an incredibly unsettling, visceral sight. It felt like this fundamental promise of the landscape had just been broken, You're looking at a mountain range completely stripped of its winter coat.
Right.
And you realize that means the entire state has just been stripped of its water security.
Yeah, because you were physically seeing the absence of the state's lifeline, basically. That bare rock wasn't just, a scenic disappointment.
No, not at all.
It was a literal manifestation of a system entering deep distress. You're essentially looking at an empty bank account.
That is the perfect way to describe it, an empty bank account. But then, and here is the crazy part, then comes the whiplash.
Oh, right, the 2023 shift.
Yeah, we go from staring at that dry, bare rock directly into the winter and spring of 2023, and we experience this relentless, almost biblical procession of atmospheric rivers.
It was just storm after storm after storm.
Right. The sky just opens up and does not stop for months.
Yeah.
We go from a near-record drought straight into a near-record deluge. And the result of that sudden whiplash was staggering.
It really was. It overwhelmed everything.
Yeah, like in the Salinas Valley, the rivers completely breached their banks, drowning agricultural land and, entire communities.
Right.
But the most surreal moment was down in the Tulare Basin. Over 100,000 acres of the San Joaquin Valley places where people had literally driven tractors, operated massive agricultural businesses, grown cotton and pistachios for generations were suddenly underwater.
It's hard to even wrap your head around that scale.
It is. It wasn't just a bad flood season, It was the literal resurrection of a massive ancient ghost lake. One day you're looking at this endless horizon of orchards, and the next it is a literal inland sea with waves crashing against these hastily built levees.
And that extreme swing, from staring at bare granite during a historic withering drought to watching a resurrected lake swallow 100,000 acres of agriculture that is not just a bizarre weather anomaly.
No, definitely not.
It is actually the clearest possible illustration of the fundamental truth of California. And that truth is that California is a state at war with its own geography.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second because that is a massive statement. A state at war with its own geography.
It really is the core of it all.
Right. So our mission today is to basically build the board before the game begins. We are going to map out the paradox of California's water. We're going to look at the staggering, almost unbelievable infrastructure that was built to fix that paradox.
Which is a huge story in itself.
Oh, absolutely. And then we are going to dive into the fierce, ongoing battle over how we actually count who gets to use what's left. So, to be clear, there are no culprits or villains today. We are just looking at the awe-inspiring and incredibly fragile reality of the system.
Yeah, and to really understand the whiplash of 2023 and understand why this entire system is so fragile to begin with, you first have to look at a map of California.
Right, the geography itself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But you have to look at it with the realization that in terms of human civilization and hydrology, The map is entirely upside down.
Upside down, right. So this is what our sources refer to as the ultimate mismatch, the 7580 geographic
This is
paradox.
one.
And this is basically the foundational problem of the state. If you look at the physical geography, roughly 75% of all the available water, meaning, the rain and the snow, originates in the northern third of the state and along the western slopes of the Sierra Nevada mountains.
Right, that is where the water physically falls from the sky.
Right. But roughly 80% of the demand for that water is located somewhere else entirely.
A completely different region.
Exactly. The vast majority of the population and the massive sprawling irrigated acreage of the San Joaquin Valley, it all sits baking in the dry center and the extreme south of the state.
Yeah, so it is a permanent structural mismatch. You have the water and the thirst located on completely opposite ends of this massive landmass.
It's so counterintuitive.
It is. I mean, the entirety of California's history over the last century and a half is essentially one long, desperate story of trying to close this massive physical gap between where nature drops the water
Right.
and where human beings actually decide that they wanted to live and farm.
Right. Think of it this way. I mean, imagine if a country had all its grocery stores in the northernmost province, but 80% of its hungry citizens lived hundreds of miles away in the south.
That's a great analogy, yeah.
And it gets even more complicated, right? Because it's not just a geographic mismatch, it is a chronological mismatch, too.
Exactly. The timing is totally off.
Right, because California has a Mediterranean climate, so nearly all of the precipitation arrives in just this handful of winter storms, usually between December and March.
Yeah, the water basically arrives in a very violent, concentrated window.
Yep.
And then that wet winter is followed by months, often like 6 to 8 months, of completely rainless heat.
Which is just brutal.
And that heat arrives exactly when the crops in the Central Valley and the millions of people in the southern cities need the water the absolute most.
So you basically have the water in the north when the people are in the south, and you have the water arriving in January when the demand actually peaks in July.
Exactly.
It just forces the state into this never-ending state of engineering.
It does.
But before humans started aggressively engineering a solution to this, nature had its own wildly different map, right?
Right. And what's fascinating here is that nature's original solution to this mismatch didn't involve moving water hundreds of miles south in these massive concrete channels.
Which is what we do now.
Right. Nature's map actually featured giant ancient lakes right in the middle of the state. The hydrology of the Central Valley used to be completely different than what we see today.
Okay, let's trace the history of the Tulare Basin because this really explains the ghost lake we talked about in the intro. So before the 1800s, all that Sierra snowmelt would rush down the mountains and naturally fill a massive chain of lakes right in the center of the state.
Yeah, right in the basin.
And the crown jewel of this was historic Tulare Lake. Historically, this was the largest freshwater body in the entire American West, if you're looking west of the Mississippi River.
It was massive.
Yeah, we aren't talking about a seasonal puddle here. This was an immense inland sea.
It really was a sprawling, vibrant ecosystem. I mean, it supported massive populations of migratory birds, fish, wildlife. The Central Valley wasn't just this dry golden plain that we picture today. In many places, it was basically a vast wetland.
Oh, wow, a wetland.
Yeah. But then in the late 1800s, this monumental shift began. Farmers and settlers moved into the valley, recognized the incredibly fertile soil beneath all that water, and they started aggressively altering the landscape.
And I want to be really clear about how you actually drain a lake that massive, because it wasn't just, pulling a giant drain plug.
Yeah, definitely not.
So how did they physically erase the largest lake in the West?
Well, the short answer is they starved it.
They starved it.
Yeah. Tulare Lake didn't just exist on its own, right? It was constantly fed by the massive rivers flowing down from the Sierra Nevada, so the Kings, the Kaweah, the Tule, and the Kern rivers.
Okay, so there's a constant inflow.
Exactly. So what the early agricultural pioneers did was systematically dam and divert those specific feeder rivers. They built these intricate networks of canals and levees to intercept the water before it could ever actually reach the lake bed.
Oh, I see.
And then they took that intercepted water and spread it out over the dry land to irrigate their crops. So once you choke off the inflow, the relentless Central Valley sun simply evaporates the lake away over time.
So they essentially intercepted the life support system.
Exactly.
And the result of that was just staggering. I mean, by the 1890s, this massive ancient lake had effectively vanished. It was totally drained for agricultural expansion.
It's pretty wild to think about.
It is. They took a vibrant inland sea and turned it into the bedrock of a multi-billion-dollar farming industry.
Yeah, it was a deliberate, monumental choice to prioritize agriculture over natural ecosystems. I mean, erasing Tulare Lake was basically a foundational step in creating the agricultural powerhouse of the San Joaquin Valley that we know today. But doing that completely rewired the natural hydrology of the state. They took a natural bowl that was designed by geology to hold floodwaters, and they built towns, roads, and highly lucrative farms right at the absolute bottom of it.
You know, I'm really struggling to understand the logic here.
How so?
Well, if we drained the largest lake in the West to build farms right in the bottom of a natural geographic bowl, wasn't it incredibly obvious that it would eventually flood again? I mean, did the engineers of the 1890s really think they had permanently beaten nature?
That's a great question. They didn't necessarily think they had beaten nature entirely, but they firmly believed they could manage it.
Manage it, okay.
Yeah, they placed immense faith in levee systems and upstream dams to control the rivers. They basically traded the permanent reality of a lake for the calculated risk of a 1-in-100-year flood.
I see.
But here is where the math of 19th century agricultural engineering meets the physics of 21st century climate whiplash.
Right, which brings us right back to the atmospheric rivers of 2023. Because when those storms hit, the water came down so fast and so hard that it completely overwhelmed the levees in the upstream dams.
It was too much for the system to handle.
Yeah, nature temporarily overrode a century of human engineering. It sought out the lowest point of elevation, which, is what water has done for millennia, and it resurrected Tulare Lake right over the top of 100,000 acres of modern agriculture.
And it's a stark, unavoidable reminder that human engineering is always existing in this fragile, temporary truce with the underlying geography.
A temporary truce. That's a powerful way to frame it.
Yeah, because we can build levees and canals all day long, but the physical shape of the earth, the fact that the Tulare Basin is literally a massive bowl at the bottom of a mountain range, that hasn't changed.
Right.
So when the water flows fast enough, the landscape immediately remembers what it used to be.
It really is a haunting thought, just knowing that underneath the asphalt and underneath the almond orchards and the cotton fields, the ghost of the lake is just kind of waiting for the rivers to run wild again.
Exactly. And, the Central Valley lakes were nature's original way of holding water down in the valley. Nature actually has another great storage system up in the mountains.
Oh, right.
And it's the system we still absolutely rely on today. But the problem is, it's currently melting right before our eyes.
You're talking about the Sierra Nevada snowpack.
I am.
And it is almost impossible to overstate how critical this is. The snowpack is, quite simply, California's single largest reservoir, period. On an average year, it supplies about 30% of the entire state's water.
30% is a massive chunk.
It is. Nearly a third of the water used by the massive agricultural sector, the sprawling cities, the entire economy, it all comes from this one source. And it operates on this really brilliant natural mechanical system. The snow piles up high in the granite peaks during those violent winter storms we discussed earlier.
Right.
And because it falls as snow, it acts as a frozen reservoir. It essentially locks the precipitation up as ice. So instead of rushing down into the valleys immediately and causing these devastating winter floods, it just sits there, suspended in the mountains.
Right. And then it melts gradually. Very slowly, steadily, through the spring and into the early summer. It releases a controlled flow of water exactly at the time when the dry summer heat arrives and the state's water demand starts to climb.
It's like perfect timing.
It really is. No human-built dam, no piece of concrete engineering anywhere in the world matches the Sierra snowpack for its sheer physical size or its economic utility. It essentially catches the winter deluge and time releases it for the summer drought.
But the data coming out of the mountains right now is, well, it's harrowing. If we look at the figures from the Department of Water Resources for April 1st, 2026, the numbers are genuinely terrifying.
Yeah, they really are.
And April 1st is typically the crucial date, right?
Okay.
That is when the snowpack should be at its absolute peak depth for the entire year.
Right, that's the benchmark.
But the statewide snowpack is sitting at 18% of average, just 18% of what the state relies on.
Which is a catastrophic drop.
Yeah, and if you look at the Northern Sierra, it is near 6%. And at Phillips Station, which is this historic vital measuring site where surveyors have manually measured the snow depth for decades, They went out on April 1st and found zero measurable snow.
None at all.
None. They just found bare ground.
And to really understand the severity of a failing snowpack, we have to look back at historical precedents, like the severe droughts of 1976 to 1977,
Right.
or the prolonged dry period from 1987 to 1992, and of course the punishing multi-year drought from 2012 to 2016.
Oh, that one was fresh in everyone's mind.
Exactly. These historical events exposed exactly how razor-thin the margin of survival is in California. The entire state's infrastructure is predicated on that slow, steady spring melt.
Right.
So when the frozen reservoir isn't there, the state is forced into immediate crisis management. Rivers run dry, groundwater is completely overpumped, and drastic rationing begins.
Now, here's where it gets really interesting. Because I hear this, and my instinct is to ask, if we have a warming climate, that means less snow, right?
Right.
But what if we still get the exact same amount of overall precipitation, but it just falls as rain during the winter instead of snow? I mean, is that actually a crisis? Water is water, right? Doesn't it all end up in the rivers and our human-made reservoirs eventually anyway?
It is a totally logical question. But the answer highlights this massive vulnerability in how our infrastructure was actually designed.
Okay, how so?
Well, the crisis lies entirely in the timing and the physical limits of our concrete dams. Our current human-made infrastructure, massive reservoirs like Shasta, Oroville, and Folsom, was explicitly engineered around the assumption that the snowmelt would be delayed.
Ah, I see.
Yeah, human-made dams are actually quite small relative to the total volume of water that falls on California in a single winter. They cannot possibly hold an entire winter's worth of instant rain runoff.
Oh, wow. Okay, so if a massive atmospheric river hits the Sierras, and because it's slightly warmer, all that moisture falls as liquid rain instead of snow.
Right.
It hits the granite and immediately rushes down the mountain slopes into our reservoirs all at once, right in the middle of January.
Precisely. And because our dams are too small to contain that massive sudden influx of water, the dam operators are bound by strict flood control regulations.
Which means they have to let it out.
Exactly. They have no choice but to open the spillways and release that precious fresh water out to the ocean. If they don't dump the water, the dam will overflow, or worse, it could structurally fail, which would cause catastrophic downstream flooding to cities like Sacramento.
That would be a disaster.
A total disaster. So we are forced to throw the water away in the winter just to stay safe.
We literally have to dump the water into the ocean to avoid drowning ourselves.
Yes.
But then, because all the water fell as rain and washed away in January, there is no frozen reservoir left up in the mountains to slowly melt and refill our dams in May, June, and July when we actually need it for the crops in the cities.
Exactly. An early melt, or a climate shift that routinely turns snow into rain, completely breaks the fundamental physics of the state's water storage strategy.
It just completely breaks it.
Yeah, we lose the water when it falls because we can't safely hold it, and we don't have it later when we desperately need it.
Wow. So nature's primary storage system, the snowpack, is failing us. The ancient lakes in the Central Valley were drained over a century ago. And the geographic mismatch means the water is still falling in the north, but the massive demand is still baking in the south.
Right, which raises a really important question. Under these incredibly strained conditions, with the natural systems either destroyed by early engineers or altered by a warming climate, how exactly is the state physically moving water to the 80% of the demand that needs it today?
Yeah, if the snowpack is failing to hold water until summer, how has the state not completely collapsed yet?
It's a miracle of engineering, really.
There has to be a backup system keeping the southern cities alive. And that leads us into what our sources outline as the four taps.
The four taps.
Right. Every single Californian, whether they realize it when they water their lawn, turn on their kitchen faucet, or irrigate their fields, relies on some blend of four distinct sources of water.
Yeah, let's break them down. Tap 1 is local surface water.
Okay.
These are the local rivers, streams, and small municipal reservoirs that a community can tap into directly. Now, for a few lucky, geographically blessed regions, primarily in the far north or maybe some coastal enclaves, this local surface water is almost enough to survive on.
Almost.
Right. But for the vast majority of the state's population and agriculture, it is nowhere near enough.
Right. And then tap 4, we'll skip to tap 4 for a second, is groundwater.
Yeah, groundwater is huge.
We need to talk about groundwater carefully because it is essentially California's buried savings account.
That's exactly what it is.
Right. So in normal years, communities and farms pump groundwater from deep aquifers to supplement their surface supplies. But during droughts, When the rivers run low and the state slashes surface deliveries, groundwater becomes the absolute lifeline.
The ultimate backup plan.
Yeah, people drill deeper wells and pump furiously just to keep their orchards alive.
Hmm.
But there's a massive physical consequence to this, right?
There really is. Because when you pump groundwater out of these deep aquifers faster than rain and runoff can slowly percolate back down to refill them, you aren't just draining a subterranean lake.
Right. It's not an empty cave.
Exactly. It's not a cave. You are actually altering the geology itself. Water actually helps support the physical structure of the clay and soil deep underground.
Oh, I see.
So when you suck that water out, the clay layers compress and collapse.
Wait, this is subsidence.
Yeah, subsidence. The ground literally sinks.
The ground literally sinks.
Literally. In parts of the San Joaquin Valley, overpumping has caused the elevation of the land to permanently drop by dozens of feet. Dozens of feet. That's insane.
It is. And the worst part is, once those clay layers compress, they lose their capacity to ever hold water again.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So TAP 4 is a savings account that is not just being drained. The vault itself is being crushed.
Which is terrifying to think about.
It really is.
Okay, then we have TAP 3, which is the Colorado River. This is the massive interstate lifeline that provides a huge percentage of the water for Southern California.
Right, especially places like LA and San Diego.
Yeah, the massive urban centers and also the unbelievably productive agricultural lands of the Imperial Valley in the extreme south.
But the issue with the Colorado River is that it's shared among 7 western states and Mexico, right?
Right, it's heavily divided.
Yeah, governed by this really complex legal framework known as the Law of the River. And that entire basin is experiencing a decades-long drying trend.
A mega drought. Exactly. So legal allocations, the amount of water California is actually permitted to pull from the river, are under intense pressure. They're effectively shrinking as the reservoirs like Lake Mead and Lake Powell drop to these historic, scary lows.
Which brings us to TAP 2.
TAP 2.
And TAP 2 is the absolute core of our deep dive today. TAP 2 is imported project water.
This is the big one?
Yeah. Because the local rivers aren't enough, the groundwater is literally collapsing the earth, and the Colorado River is shrinking, California survives by confronting the 75-80 geographic mismatch head-on.
By moving the water.
Right. We built 2 massive, highly engineered north-to-south delivery systems, the Central Valley Project and the State Water Project.
Yeah. So the Central Valley Project, or the CVP, is the older of the 2 massive infrastructures.
Right.
It is a federal project constructed and managed by the United States Bureau of Reclamation, beginning way back in the 1930s. Its primary mandate has always been to capture the abundant flows of the northern rivers and route them south to serve the massive, thirsty agricultural demands of the Central Valley.
And then running somewhat parallel to that, you have the State Water Project, the SWP.
Right, a state version.
Yeah, this was launched later in the 1960s, and it was driven by state leadership. Now, while it certainly delivers water to agriculture in the valley, its defining mandate, its massive overriding purpose is delivering drinking water to more than 27 million people.
Right.
This is the engineered lifeline that keeps the sprawling population centers of Southern California alive.
And to really comprehend the State Water Project, you have to look at the sheer physics of what it accomplishes.
It's mind-blowing.
It really is. The spine of this system is the California Aqueduct. It is essentially a man-made concrete river that runs for roughly 300 miles down the length of the Central Valley.
You can see it from space.
Yeah, visible from space, just carrying northern water south.
But the most staggering part of this, the part that genuinely borders on human hubris, I think happens when this artificial river hits the Tehachapi Mountains.
Oh, yeah. This is where it gets crazy.
Right, because the aqueduct runs south, and suddenly there is a massive mountain range blocking the path to Los Angeles. And, you know, water does not naturally flow uphill.
Nature dictates that water flows down to the sea.
Right.
But human demand dictated otherwise. So to solve this problem, the engineers constructed the Edmonston pumping plant right at the base of the Tehachapi Mountains.
I really want to spend a moment on the physics of this pumping plant because it is just mind-bending.
It's an engineering marvel.
It is. The Edmonston facility is the highest single water lift anywhere in the world. It doesn't just pump water over a little hill.
No, not at all.
It uses these massive multi-story motors that consume just unimaginable amounts of electricity to physically push nearly 2 million gallons of water every single minute.
Every single minute.
Yes, and it pushes that massive, heavy volume of water nearly 2,000 feet straight up the side of a mountain, through miles of steel pipes, over the crest of the Tehachapi Range, just so it can flow down the other side into the Los Angeles Basin.
I mean, it really is a monument to humanity's absolute refusal to accept geographic limitations.
A refusal to accept reality, almost.
Exactly. It requires so much electricity just to run those pumps that the State Water Project is actually the single largest consumer of power in the entire state of California.
Wait, really?
Yes. We burn vast amounts of energy simply to drag a river up a mountain.
That is wow. We are literally fighting gravity every single second of every day to keep the southern half of the state hydrated.
Yep.
But both of these massive systems, the Federal Central Valley Project and the State Water Project, they actually share a single incredibly vulnerable choke point, don't they?
They do, because before the water ever gets to the aqueducts,
Yeah.
and long before it hits the massive pumps at the mountains, both systems capture water in the north, and both systems must pull their southbound water through the exact same place, the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta.
The Delta.
The Delta. It is this vast, intricate network of islands and channels where the Sacramento River flowing from the north and the San Joaquin River flowing from the south finally meet. It is a really delicate estuary, a tidal zone where the fresh water from the rivers pushes out toward the salt water of the San Francisco Bay and the Pacific Ocean.
It is basically the switchboard for the entire state. Almost all of the project water bound for the southern farms and the southern cities is pumped out of the extreme southern edge of this delicate estuary.
Which is a precarious place to put it.
It is. The giant intake pumps for both the federal and state projects sit right there in the Delta, which makes the Delta the single most fought-over, litigated, and controversial piece of real estate in all of California water politics.
Oh, without a doubt.
I mean, we are using a fragile tidal wetland as the central plumbing junction for the fifth largest economy in the world.
And the ecological physics of what happens when you turn those massive pumps on is deeply problematic.
Yeah, explain that a bit.
Well, the pumps at the southern edge of the delta are so powerful that they literally alter the hydrology of the estuary. When you pump millions of acre-feet of fresh water out to send it down the aqueducts, you drastically reduce the outward flow of fresh water that naturally pushes against the ocean tides.
Ah, and if the fresh water isn't pushing out hard enough, the ocean pushes back.
Exactly. This causes what's known as saltwater intrusion. Saltwater from the San Francisco Bay creeps deeper and deeper inland into the delta channels.
Which is bad news.
It is an ecological catastrophe for freshwater fish and wetlands. But beyond just the environment, it is an existential threat to the water supply itself.
Right, because of the salt.
Yeah, if that salt water intrudes too far, it reaches the very pumps that feed the aqueducts. You literally risk contaminating the drinking water for 27 million people with ocean salt.
But it's even wilder than just saltwater intrusion, right? The pumps are so massive that they actually cause reverse flow.
They do. It's crazy to think about. But in certain channels of the delta, the suction from the state and federal pumps is so intense that the natural flow of the river is literally reversed.
The river flows backward.
Yes, the water flows backward, away from the ocean and toward the pumps. And this completely disorients endangered fish species like the delta smelt and migrating salmon, pulling them directly toward the massive pumping screens.
It is an incredibly precarious balancing act. I mean, we have built an entire civilization on the premise of pushing a river 2,000 feet over a mountain range,
Right.
pulling that water backward through a fragile, salty estuary, all while relying on a melting snowpack to provide the fresh water in the first place.
It's a lot of spinning plates.
It is. So when you look at the Edmonston Lift and the reverse flow in the Delta, the collapsing groundwater aquifers, and the shrinking snowpack, I have to ask, can this system actually survive the future? Can this massively engineered infrastructure withstand the climate instability we are now seeing?
Well, if you assess the stability of the entire architecture objectively, the outlook is deeply sobering. The physical limits of the system are loudly announcing themselves.
Yeah.
We are draining the groundwater vault. We are facing a shrinking legal allocation from an overtapped Colorado River. We have intense ecological crisis and saltwater threats in the Delta.
Right.
And we have a failing Sierra snowpack that can no longer guarantee the timing or the volume of our water. When you combine all of those structural points of failure, it suggests very strongly that the foundational strategy of the last century Moving ever more water from the north to the south may no longer be physically or economically sustainable.
Which is just a massive realization. But, considering the monumental backbreaking effort required to move all this water, the engineering, the electricity, the billions of dollars, the ecological destruction, it is wild to realize that the most bitter, unresolved fight in the state isn't actually about how we move the water.
That's right. That's just mechanics.
Yeah, the most toxic battle is over who gets to claim it once it finally arrives.
Which brings us to the numbers fight. Because water in California isn't just a physical resource, it is a highly weaponized statistical argument.
Yes, this is the 50-40-10 versus the 80-20 paradox.
Exactly.
Now, as we dive into this next section, I really want to be clear with you listening. Our role right now is entirely objective.
We're just looking at the source material.
Right. Both of the mathematical formulas we are about to describe are factually, statistically correct. They use the exact same data. They just measure completely different things. And how you choose to look at them shapes your entire worldview of California water.
Yeah, let's break down framing one, which is commonly referred to as the dedicated water framing.
Okay, dedicated water.
This method counts every single drop of water that the state manages or counts for in an average year. Critically, this includes water that is purposefully left in the river's water that is not piped away for human consumption.
So it counts the natural flow, too.
Right. If you look at the total pie of all dedicated water in the state, the split is roughly 50% environmental, 40% agricultural, and 10% urban.
Now, 50% environmental sounds absolutely massive, so we need to define exactly what environmental water means legally in this formula.
Right. It's an important distinction.
Because it is not just water sitting in a pristine forest. When we say 50% goes to the environment, we mean flows in wild and scenic rivers, primarily in the far north, that are legally protected from ever being dammed or diverted.
Right.
We mean water left in specific streams to maintain critical fish populations and protect wetlands. And, very importantly, based on what we just discussed, we mean the massive volume of fresh water that is legally required to flow out through the delta and into the ocean, specifically to push back the salt water and prevent the pumps from pulling in ocean water. So under framing one, the environment is the single largest user of water at 50%. Agriculture, the economic engine of the valley, gets 40%, and the cities, where 27 million people live, shower, and water their lawns, get just 10%.
But then you have framing two, which we can call the developed water or applied water framing.
Okay.
This method changes the entire denominator of the equation. It counts only the water that human beings actively capture, divert, pipe, and apply to homes, businesses, and agricultural fields.
So it ignores the rivers.
Right. It completely strips out the in-stream flows, the wild rivers, and the delta outflow protections from the pie chart. It only looks at the water humans physically control and consume.
And when you strip the environmental water out of the math, the pie shrinks and the percentages shift radically. Yeah, under framing two, the developed water framing agriculture suddenly uses roughly 80% of the water, and urban areas use roughly 20%. Suddenly, the environment isn't even a slice on the pie chart, and farming absolutely dwarfs everything else.
And like we said, both of these framings are factually true.
Right.
They are simply drawing the boundary of what constitutes water use in two different places.
Yeah.
But what is truly important is how different groups weaponize these identical data sets to justify opposing political and economic goals.
It's all about framing.
Exactly. The choice of which statistic to quote is a highly calculated political act.
So let's look at how the farmers use the data. If you are an agricultural advocate or a farmer operating in the San Joaquin Valley, you are naturally going to cite the 40% figure from the first framing.
Of course.
You use it to argue, look, we don't even use half the water in the state. The environment uses more than we do. Or if forced to acknowledge the 80% developed figure, you argue that using 80% of the managed water is incredibly efficient relative to the output. You point out that this water produces massive, literal mountains of food, fruits, nuts, vegetables that feed the entire country and a large part of the world. You use the numbers to show you are a responsible steward doing vital, irreplaceable work with the water you are allocated.
Conversely, if you are an environmental advocate or an agency trying to protect a collapsing fish population, you are going to focus fiercely on that 80% developed water figure.
Naturally.
Yeah, you use that exact same data to argue that Because farming captures 80% of the water that humans actually have the power to control and distribute, agriculture is the giant, obvious, and necessary lever that the state must pull during a severe shortage.
Right, because it's the biggest piece of the pie.
Exactly. You argue that to save a dying river ecosystem, the cities conserving a few drops here and there won't make a dent. Agriculture has to take the massive cuts because they hold the vast majority of the managed supply.
And the urban water agencies, representing Los Angeles, San Francisco, San Diego, they just sit back and point out that whether you use the 10% figure from framing 1 or the 20% figure from framing 2, they are a tiny sliver of the pie either way.
Right, they're the smallest slice.
Yeah. They argue that they have implemented massive low-flow toilet programs, ripped out millions of square feet of grass, and pushed urban conservation to the absolute limit. They argue that you cannot squeeze the cities any harder to solve a structural deficit caused by millions of acres of water-intensive crops.
So when activists, farming coalitions, and government agencies argue over water rights, and they throw these percentages at each other in press conferences or federal lawsuits, they aren't actually arguing over a mathematical error.
Right.
The math is correct on both sides.
So when activists or agencies argue over water rights, they aren't actually arguing over the math, they're arguing over the philosophy of what a river is for.
Yes, exactly. Whether leaving fresh water in a river so that it can flow all the way to the ocean to keep an estuary healthy counts as a use of water, or whether that is considered a tragic waste of fresh water that could have been pumped south to grow almonds and keep farm workers employed, that is fundamentally a dispute about human values.
Wow.
Yeah. Every single time someone chooses to frame the statistics as 5040, 10, or 80-20, they are quietly deciding whose water matters, whose needs are legitimate, and whose livelihood is expendable.
So what does this all mean? We have covered immense ground today.
We really have.
We started with the sheer whiplash of living in this state, the agonizing drought that left the Sierra granite bare, and the violent deluge that overwhelmed the levees and brought the ghost of Tulare Lake back from the dead to swallow the farmland.
A total extreme swing.
Yeah, and we mapped the lopsided permanent geographic paradox, right?
Yeah.
With the water falling in the wet north while the massive demand bakes in the dry south.
And we walk through how the early pioneers drained the natural Central Valley lakes, forever altering the hydrology.
Right.
We stared at the perilous, melting reality of the Sierra snowpack, our failing frozen reservoir that is shifting from slow-melting snow to fast-running rain,
Yeah.
completely overwhelming our dam capacity.
And we trace the sheer physics of the infrastructure, too. I mean, the monumental pumps lifting rivers 2,000 feet over the Tehachapi Mountains, and that fragile, backward-flowing switchboard of the delta that tries to hold the whole system together.
A whole precarious system.
Yeah. And finally, we unpack the political weaponization of statistics, where math simply becomes a proxy war for competing human values.
It all leads back to the core thesis of our deep dive into the source material today.
Right, which is?
California's water system is not a natural fact.
Yeah.
Water does not naturally flow uphill to Los Angeles, and ancient lake beds do not naturally stay dry.
No, they don't.
Every single drop of water that moves through a concrete pipe, every acre-foot pumped out of the delta, every river diverted, is the result of a human choice. And in a landscape defined by scarcity and extreme weather whiplash, every choice inevitably have a loser. Today, we simply built the board. We laid out the physics, the infrastructure, and the paradoxes that define the game.
And as we wrap up, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over. For the last 150 years, California's answer to its massive geographical mismatch was simple, brutal, and completely awe-inspiring.
We engineered the landscape.
Exactly. We engineered the landscape to fit our desires. We drained inland seas. We built towering concrete dams. We literally pushed massive rivers over mountain ranges using millions of megawatts of electricity. Also, that millions of people could live and farm wherever they wanted, regardless of where the rain actually fell.
But as the climate shifts, as the frozen reservoir of the snowpack vanishes into winter rain, we cannot safely catch.
Yeah.
As the groundwater aquifers collapse beneath our feet, and as ancient lakes occasionally rise from the dead to violently reclaim their historical territory, we have to ask a fundamental question about our survival in the future.
In the next century, as the geography fights back harder than ever, will we keep trying to invent new, massively expensive ways to engineer the water to exactly where the demand is? Or will nature finally, inevitably, force us to move the demand back to where the water is?
It's the ultimate question.
It's the question that sits at the bottom of every dry reservoir and every flooded field. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. Keep questioning the physical world around you, keep looking closely at the landscape, and we will catch you next time.